You are listening to podcast MADAR.
On behalf of the Palestinian Forum for Israeli Studies, MADAR, I'd like to welcome our two guests and everyone joining us today. My name, as was noted, is Sam Bahour, and I speak to you from Ramallah, occupied Palestine. I'll be moderating today's book event. The book that has brought us all together is What is Modern Israel? By Professor Yakov Rabkin. This book was translated from French to English by Fred Reed, and today's event marks MADAR's Arabic translation and publication of the book. Our two guests are the book's author, Professor Rabkin, who comes to us from Montreal, and to provide commentary is my good friend, PhD candidate Azar Dakwar, who comes to us from Belgium today. A warm welcome to MADAR, to you both, on what in Palestine and Israel are bone-chilling days, literally and figuratively. Let me first start by introducing the book's author, Professor Rabkin. St. Petersburg, formerly known as Leningrad, was Professor Rabkin's birthplace. Born and educated in the former Soviet Union, today he is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Montreal. His research interests relate to the history of the Soviet Union and the consequences of its dismemberment, the contemporary history of the Jews, and the history of Zionism and the State of Israel, and the sciences and education as factors in international relations. Professor Rabkin has studied Judaism at the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim, the Paradis Institute, the Shalom Hartman Institute, and the Beit Morasha Center for Advanced Jewish Studies in Jerusalem. Also at the Center Rache in Paris, and privately with several rabbis. He was an associate member of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs for over a decade and collaborated with Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz of Jerusalem in reviving Jewish education in the former Soviet Union in the late 1980s. He has also consulted in the field of science policy for OECD, NATO, the World Bank, and the Government of Canada. I'm sure I can go on. Welcome again, Professor Rabkin.
Thank you. Thank you.
Also with us today to provide critical commentary is Azar Dakwar. Azar is a PhD student in political and social thought at Brussels School of International Studies, University of Kent, where he is completing a dissertation titled Thinking the Muslim Question by Rethinking the Jewish Question, a critique of Frankfurt School's secular analytics of religion, a mouthful. In addition to the politics of Palestine and Israel, his scholarly interests revolve around the modern question and category of religion and the problematics of domination, emancipation, and progress in critical theory, political theology, and political economy. His work appeared and is forthcoming, among others, in Critical Horizons, Theory and Event, Contemporary Political Theory, European Law Journal, the Journal of Palestinian Studies in Arabic, and Theory and Criticism in Hebrew. He is co-editor of Rethinking the Politics of Israel-Palestine, Partition and Its Alternatives, which was published in 2014 with Dr. Bashir, and which I'm proud to note that I contributed a co-authored chapter with Dr. Tony Klung to that edition. And he also co-edited Israel and the Apartheid, a comparative study in 2018 with none other than Dr. Hunayd Deralem in Arabic. Welcome again, Azar. I learned of the book, What is Modern Israel, from an article in the news site Monday Weiss, announcing the publication of the English version of the book by Pluto Press. It intrigued me. I got the book and read it. Given I regularly speak to Jewish groups touring Palestine, I felt those particular audiences needed to know all about this book. So I decided to write a book review and subsequently suggested to Professor Rabkin and then to MADAR to translate the book to Arabic. Allow me to start our discussion by reading the opening paragraph of my review. As someone who gives political talks from a Palestinian vantage point to groups traveling through Palestine, I have spoken to thousands of Jews, among others, from around the world. I walked away from reading Professor Yakov Rabkin's What is Modern Israel with the burning desire to call back every one of those Jewish travelers and sit down with them, one-on-one, over a hot cup of mint tea, so that I could read to them each of his chapters aloud, looking up and into their eyes at the end of every chapter to ask soberly, do you get it now? You have been had collectively. You have been lied to collectively. You are being used collectively. Your religion, a rich one, has been hijacked purposely. Professor Rabkin, as I understand, the Jewish audience was not your intended audience when you wrote the original edition. Can you share a little bit with us about why you wrote this book?
Well, the history of this book begins in a very unlikely place, in Japan. My previous book on the history of Jewish opposition to Zionism was translated in quite a few languages, including Arabic in Beirut, and it was also translated into Japanese. In Japan, surprisingly, it was listed among the best books of the year. And during the banquet that followed the presentation in Tokyo, the publisher, very happy, said, "Would you write a little book about Israel for young Japanese readers?" And I said, well, it's an idea. And even though we imbibed quite a bit of sake by that time, he came back to me the following day and said, yes, he confirmed he wanted me to do it. So I wrote it really for a Japanese youth audience. But since I wrote it in French, I don't read or write Japanese. I also published it in French. So that's the history of the book. Now I think it exists in 5 or 6 languages.
Is Hebrew one of those languages?
No, my other book was translated into Hebrew and was called, actually, the title of the book, of the previous book on Jewish history, on the history of Jewish opposition to Zionism, in Hebrew there was a subtitle added, A History of a Continuing Struggle.
Interesting.
That was, I think it's Toldot HaMa'avak HaNimshach. That's how it was put.
I hope this one also gets translated to Hebrew. You write in the book, and I quote, "To understand Israel, it is necessary to distinguish between religion, ethnicity, and nationalism," unquote. This seems to be a fundamental underpinning of the book. Can you explain further what you mean here?
Well, we operate with Western, or to be more precise, European concepts. And these concepts are distinct: religion, ethnicity, and nationality. Jews used to be considered, throughout millennia really, as a group united by a certain commitment to Torah and commandments. It varied. Some were more committed than others, but essentially that was the definition. And that's why the word used to describe by various medieval scholars was the Arabic, it's the same word in Arabic and in Hebrew, ummah, which is really a community of, believers or community united in some kind of religious way. Now, what happened in the 19th century in Europe, and it didn't happen elsewhere, and that's very important, there was an attempt to get away from Judaism. Many Jews abandoned it. Some converted to Christianity, some became free thinkers, whatever. And they disappeared, more or less, among the population. There was one place where this was not possible. In other words, it was possible to leave Judaism, to leave the observance of commandments, but it was not possible to move to the capital city to become like any other Russian citizen because of the discrimination, official discrimination in the Russian Empire, which prevented most Jews from moving to big cities like St. Petersburg or Moscow, and so on. As a result, there was a critical mass of people in the western part of the former Russian Empire, which is today Moldova, Ukraine, Belarus, more Lithuania. And these people had to live in a very closed environment, but they were no longer observant, they were no longer religious. And it was happening at the time of tremendous revolutionary turmoil in the Russian Empire. Mm-hmm. So these people were radicalized, as many of them as revolutionaries, and as socialists, they were, of course, against religion, but they wanted to identify themselves. Who are they? And they wanted, obviously, to identify positively, because Hebrew, I suppose, just like Arabic, has a whole variety of terms for people who don't observe the commandments. They didn't like those, of course. So they chose a new one, a secular Jew. And a secular Jew became a nationality. Why? Because all around them, there were Lithuanians and Ukrainians and Poles who wanted to affirm their national identity. So Jews also said, we also are a nation in the European sense of the word. So this is how nationality came about. And it became an official term in two countries in the 20th century, in the Soviet Union and in the State of Israel. This history shows that the idea of having a nation state for a nationality is basically a European idea created by Jews in the Russian Empire. And I would add that the Russian dimension of this Zionist project is extremely important, not because I was born there and so on, but it is important because I just mentioned to you that before Bennett, all the previous prime ministers were either born in the Russian Empire or born of parents in the Russian Empire. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, and it is extremely important to understand also today's input, political input, of the 1 million who immigrated from the former Soviet Union to Israel.
Absolutely. And I think you have a vantage point which is very unique right now, because as we see in the current Ukraine crisis, Israel is in a very difficult position because they have strategic relationships with Russia, but they also have very good relationships with Ukraine. And the heavy Russian presence inside Israel, I think, is complicating the way that they are approaching this conflict. So if you fast forward what you just said till today, it still applies in one shape, way, or form. Professor, as you are aware, the language about Israel has been seriously shifting over the last 2 decades. Ever since the decline of Oslo and that process, Israel has been more exposed to the world about what it's doing on a daily basis to embed not only the occupation, but more than that, in terms of oppressing another people. We speak, especially the younger generation today here, they speak much less of military occupation and more of defining Israel as a colonialist project. You address this head on in your book and give it historical context. Can you recap that historical context of how colonialism played a role within the Zionist mindset?
Well, the idea of a firm nationality, Jewish nationality, could find realization in various ways. One of them was the Bund, the Socialist Union of Workers in Lithuania and Poland, former Russian Empire. Another way of affirming it was the creation of a nation state, and unclear where. It could be in Argentina, it could be Canada, it could be in Uganda, whatever. Then what happened is that this idea of finding a colony to colonize, and I'm not talking about Palestine specifically, it could be Uganda, it could be anything. the idea of colonizing it with European settlers was a perfectly natural and well-accepted idea. If you look at the history of the rest of the world, including Canada, it's a colonial settlement. And that's why those Zionists who wanted to have a colony somewhere indeed were in the mainstream. If I'm not mistaken, Bank Leumi, its maiden name was Jewish Colonial Trust.
Interesting.
So we have to really, as people who have historical sensitivity, to understand that what they were doing then, Europeans settling in non-European contexts, was a very common thing to do. Now, Palestine comes into play largely under the impact of Russian Jews. As you know, there was a conflict in the beginning of the 20th century among Zionists. And also, as you know, a very important input to all this, and I would say a crucial one, and continues to be crucial, is that of evangelical Christians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was intrigued by the section in the book which actually talks about the Protestant and evangelical Christian underpinning of the entire Zionist movement. It's well worth reading where it's coming from to understand what it is.
Till today.
Till today, in a very real way.
Yeah, because see, what we always forget, and I'm glad that my colleagues Walt and Mersheimer called their book Israel Lobby, not Jewish Lobby, because the number of Jews in the world, I think, is less than 15 million, including babies and old people like myself. And the number of Christian Zionists, according to their own leaders, in the United States alone is 50 million.
Yes, you depict this very clearly in the book, which is really a worth read, because knowing the background gives us some kind of understanding of where this solidarity today comes between these two communities, which are ideologically looking very opposite. I mean, logic would say Israel should not be embracing evangelical Christians who basically are waiting for Armageddon, right? But there's a backing to, there's a whole history to it. And I encourage people to focus on that part of the book, given the role Christian evangelicals are playing today.
And I think that one should emphasize an extremely important role in mobilizing Christian Zionists in support of Israel of the former Israeli representative at the United Nations, Benjamin Netanyahu.
Absolutely.
He spent a lot of time going to the south of the United States, and people were wondering, why is he going to Tennessee? There are 2.5 Jews there, but he was doing the right thing for him.
He had a strategy. Moving on, and my last question before we move to Azar, you hit head on in the book of something of what Palestinians have been saying since day one, that the source of our misery is the Zionist movement. We always focused on that movement as being the origins of our misery. Israel is kind of an outcome of that. And you cover this in great detail, from the origins of Zionism to how Zionism has become wedded to the state of Israel, or vice versa. How has Zionism succeeded in such an overwhelming way in whitewashing its origins and assuming today that Judaism is one of its main pillars, as if they're one and the same? How have they been able to do that?
Well, I think the history of Israel is, in that sense, very instructive, because it was founded by people, when the Zionist project was founded by people that had very little appreciation for Judaism, and many of them rejected it outright, and were in turn rejected by traditional Jews. So there was a tremendous conflict between them. The idea was to build a new man, a new Hebrew. And I think here, for those of you who know Hebrew, it's very important to distinguish between Yehudi and Ivri, because Ivri was really this new man who was free of religious shackles and who was a new person, who was very different from the Jews, from the Yehudim in the diaspora, or in Jerusalem for that matter. So this continued till about the creation of the establishment of Israel in 48. Because in order to mobilize Jews, this conflict between Jews and Hebrews was not a very practical thing to go about it. And eventually, particularly after the Eichmann trial and after the Six-Day War of 67 war, Judaism was mobilized to support the project. It was done by very committed people, many of whom became settlers in the occupied territories. And I would say that the most important institution to produce this kind of political and religious movement was Merkaz Harav in Jerusalem. It's a big yeshiva and research center. The son of the former chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Palestine, Tzvi Yehuda Kook, he was the son of Rabbi Kook, really managed to mobilize and reinterpret Judaism so that it could become a very potent arm in the hands of the settlers and those who support them. At the same time, I must say, the conflict between traditional Jews and the Zionist establishment continues. And that's why I mentioned the title of the book, of the other book, Toldot Mavak Nimshach, the continuing struggle. Incidentally, I can just tell you an episode. When I went, it was in 2014 that it was translated into Hebrew, and I was in Israel to promote it. I just arrived, and then I get a phone call from the publisher in Haifa, and he says, Yakov, did you organize this? I say, what? Open the television. So I looked at it. There were 500,000 Haredi Jews, now very religious Jews, demonstrating against military service at the entrance to Jerusalem. Wow. It was very good timing for me because people asked me in the media, why don't they want to go to the army? What's happening? So it's the conflict continues, but the mobilization of religion for political purposes has been very successful. And unfortunately, Judaism is not the only religion that has been mobilized politically in the world.
Absolutely. And there's a section in the book which talks about the violence that was employed to make this transition happen. Mm-hmm. Zionists that came from Europe, resettled in Jerusalem, were murdered in the streets outside of synagogues because they were exposing what was happening on the ground. And I encourage people to look at that and see how violence was part and parcel of that entire Zionist presence and establishment of the state of Israel.
Yes, because you see, I think if I'm not mistaken, I haven't read my book for a while. I think there is a subchapter on the origins of terrorism.
Yes, and you talk about Hans, who was murdered in Jerusalem.
Right. So I think one has to understand that revolutionary violence, revolutionary terrorism was very common in the turn of the 20th century in the Russian Empire, in a very radicalized sources, socialist revolutionaries, Bolsheviks, and others. So when you see where it comes from, it becomes totally logical.
Understood. I'd like to move to Azar, who will engage you with some of his thinking after looking at the book, and we'll come back and then have a very brief closing.
Sure.
Azar, floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Professor Rabkin. That clarifies a lot your answers to Sam's question. I'm concerned. I have 3 or 4 concerns about the book, and more specifically, my concerns are coming from a place, from the place of being Palestinian, yeah, from that sphere, that feeling, that experience, that political experience as well of being Palestinian. And as much as I am, so keen on getting all the distinctions you make, and I think they are super relevant, and the existence of the Jews in Palestine, this question has been always theological before, being political. It's a theological question, and it's a political theological question of the first, of a first rate, just the question itself. So I fully, take your perspective into account, and I take it seriously. And it is not just, I think that, it has power. It moves things in the world. These perspectives, people operate with perspectives and counter perspective, and you are bringing the counter sort of halachic perspective, critical perspective of Zionism from a sort of orthodox halachic perspective, and it is very powerful and very important. My concern, however, as a Palestinian, you emphasize all the time that we have still, even now, to distinguish between Zionists and Jews, between Judaism and Zionism. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you try to supply us, with some criteria, with some guidelines, with some, heuristics, how to do it. Yeah. While it's clear that, while the Bund and the Zionists were there in the Russian Empire in the 19th century, one could do that much, it could have been done much easier, One knew what the Bund stood for, what, Hasidic perspective, and argument about Jewish existence in Europe, what was it about, what the Zionists wanted before they wanted, to go to Palestine, and that they were part of sort of the modernist nationalist tide at the time, and so on and so forth. I can understand that this is as well possible in 1930, in 1920, in 1945 even, But after the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, whereby Jews for the first time in modern history, and even much, much more than modern history, since 2000 years, become sovereigns, yeah. And Jewish exile, the experience of Jewish exile is negated in a very modernist terms, with the use, as you very much clearly and beautifully in your book expound and show, Protestant and Protestant secularist ideas of sovereignty, which are to a large extent antithetical to the Jewish understanding of sovereignty, yeah, especially of divine sovereignty versus earthly sovereignty, and to what extent these two forms of sovereignty are, how they are connected. How can we still, after the birth of the State of Israel, and I don't say invention of the State of Israel or the invention of the Jewish people like Shlomo Zand, the birth of the Jewish people as not as Am Yisrael, not as Am Yisrael, the people of the book, and of the commandment and of certain rituals and practices, but the birth of the Jewish people as people who have nationalist yearning in the European sense of it, and which the Hebraistic perspective, the Protestant perspective, grounded them, their political subjectivity in the world, not anymore, sort of certain halachic conceptions, of exilic existence. So, and at one and the same time, drawing the raison d'etre of being a Jew, of this reborn Jew, yeah, from the book, and from the covenant and the commandments. How can we really distinguish between Jews, living Jews, yeah, real Jews anymore, and Zionists, if the Jews who are supposedly we can distinguish from Zionists, yeah, don't take responsibility for what the Zionist, has done in the world, ever since they established their sovereign state. How is it possible? Yeah.
Well, it's a very good question. And the two groups, Zionists and Jews, overlap.
Yes.
They are very committed Jews who are also very committed Zionists. Just as there are, as I mentioned before, the vast majority of Zionists are Christian. So we have to remember that. And there are Jews who maintain their traditional identity without any commitment to Zionism or even opposition to Zionism. So they're non-Zionist and anti-Zionist. The distinction has to be made on, I think, in a very simple way. There are people for whom the maintenance of the Zionist state, not as any state, but a Zionist state, with the statutory superiority of the Jews, and the fact that the state belongs to all the Jews of the world. I mean, all these Zionist postulates, for people for whom it is essential and primordial, I would call them Zionists. Those who consider it a political structure, just as many others that are ephemeral and that may go away, and definitely for those who, as you know, in Israel have been arguing for recognition, official recognition of the Israeli nationality. You see, that's the paradox of the Israeli existence, that there are, I think, over 100 nationalities officially recognized by the Ministry of Interior, and they can put it into whatever official documents, but they don't recognize Israeli nationality. Yes, there is citizenship, but not nationality. Because the moment Israeli nationality, which includes then Muslims, Christians, Jews, Arabs, whatever, the moment it's officially recognized, the state is no longer Zionist. Then we can talk about a more normal state, so to speak. Today, it's a very unusual state, I would say, very, very unusual, not only in the practical sense that a Jew from Montreal can settle tomorrow in the midst of Palestine without any problem, whereas I think a Palestinian marrying someone would have tremendous difficulty moving into Israel and so on. So the distinction has to be understood. It has to be very clear. Yes, there are people who are committed to both, but it's important to verify which of the two commitments is more important.
Yep.
I would just add that in the ritual sense, even the most committed Zionist, religious Zionists, the most committed settlers in Palestine, occupied Palestine, when it comes to Jewish holidays and the prayers said during Jewish holidays, even they say, because of our sins, we have been exiled from our land, even though they live there.
This is exactly my point. So the question is, I totally understand what you say, but Israel, the law of return, if I may put it this way, is the major generator of Jews, discursive Jews nowadays in the world. Yeah. Like, it is the major instrument. State of Israel has the major instrument of producing Jews in the world, just discursively, the Jews, Now, from your perspective, they are Zionists, From the perspective of the State of Israel, they are Jews, as you just said, not Israelis, Here is the power, this is what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that in the wake of the State of Israel, no Jewish consciousness, even the one which opposes Zionism and opposed Zionism historically for 150, stayed the same, and exilic, Jewish collectivity, the forms of exilic Jewish collectivity cannot escape the field of gravity, of Zionism and the State of Israel, and the way they shape what is Judaism and what is Jewishness, and who is a Jew and who is not a Jew. Yeah. In this sense, even the most, even the most anti-Zionist Jew, yeah, would have to take a position, or would have to, position himself or herself vis-a-vis, what the earthly sovereign Jews, are doing, in Israel. So in this sense, to what extent do you consider, you and Zionist Jews, part of the same people or not? Are you part of the Jewish people or part of Am Yisrael? Or what you're trying to say actually, that we have actually probably here people which have configured itself according to the precepts of modern nationalism, and people which still exist as a collectivity, you say, and we can distinguish between those subjects and the others, still configures itself according to the communitarian, as a community of faith, which is exilic and which is non-territorial and non-sovereign in the modern sense of the word. So you see what I mean? It's a question about political responsibility. At the end, it's about political responsibility. To what extent you can say, or Jews can still say, who oppose Zionism, can still say, not in our name.
Well,
because this is not sufficient. I'm arguing.
Well, what is sufficient is a matter of practicality. But let me, as you were talking, I thought of an episode that happened to me personally in Shanghai. See, getting to East Asia more. It was a Shabbat, and I went to a local synagogue. And it was just before the day of Israeli independence. It was pretty much in May, something like that. And the rabbi spoke, and he didn't mention at all Israel or independence or anything. He talked about Jewish matters altogether. And then there was, as usual in Shabbat, there was a little reception, drinking and eating, and I overheard the conversation of two ladies, American, both of them New Yorkers. There was a more modern lady, was very, very angry. She says, "What kind of a rabbi is this? We are 3 days away from the Day of Independence of Israel. He didn't even mention it. What kind of Judaism is this?" And then the other one was a Hasidic woman, and she said, "But why would he mention it? What? Oh, but that's the basis of our Judaism. You have to understand that. How can you not mention it?" To which this Hasidic woman says, "Well, it's definitely not part of our Judaism, and we managed to live without it." Finally, the more modern one says, "Well, explain to me, how do you do it?" He says, "You know what? There's a Canadian professor who wrote a book precisely about this. How can you be a Jew without being a Zionist?" And I didn't intervene. I was just very happy that. But in fact, the two ladies separated by the East River, one lived in Brooklyn, the other one in Manhattan, represented those two types of Jews. For one, Israel is an integral part. It's what matters. That's what makes her a Jew, as you put, a discursive Jew. The other one is more traditional, and for her, it was totally irrelevant. It's not that she was opposed or not opposed, it was irrelevant. Now, political responsibility is something else. Political responsibility, in my humble opinion, is something that devolves to people who live in the country in question, or who take part in political movements supporting that state, one way or another. I don't think that there is some political responsibility that could be attributed to Jews and Christians, say in the United States or in North America in general, that support the state of Israel, support the Zionist character of the state, and so on. Yes, there is political responsibility, but I repeat, it's not connected with Judaism, it's connected with the Zionist commitment. If I understood your question correctly.
I see. I see. No, no, you definitely understood my question, but this still perplexes me. So
That's the best compliment. That's
Yeah,
if
yeah,
someone
yeah.
comes
No, no.
with
Of course,
a book with a
these are not
question, wonderful.
these are not matters which I think are as well easily resolvable. As you wrote an entire book or books, even you have your previous book as well, which is wonderful on that, and still so many things are open ended still, because religion and nationalism in the Israeli case, Zionist ideology, they constitute one another. Yeah. So
What do you mean constitute one another?
they are mutually constitutive. Yeah. That's how the law this is how Israel actually has embedded. You say, we have to understand operating with European categories, ethnicity, religion, nationalism. You don't mention race, but race as well, which is, I think, is very important in here, but never mind. But also the hybridization of these categories and the mutual constitution, that Israel, the project called Israel and Zionism in Israel has harbored is amazing, So to a large extent, you cannot, in whatever sense, become an Israeli citizen. Yeah, again, Israeli citizen versus a Jew, unless you are a Jew religion-wise, in the narrow sense. So, and this is exactly what I'm talking about. So, they have mixed the cards, to a point where you cannot, in whatever practical sense, not analytical sense, dissociate them. Yeah.
I think Sam.
This, if I may continue my point, I think has repercussions also on the Jewish consciousness of non-Zionist Jews. Yeah, this has repercussions on, like, nothing is left unscathed here. It has repercussions. It had repercussions exactly like the conversation between the two ladies you said. So why do they have to mention Israel? They have to mention Israel. Discursive Jew again, it is. But and when the Zionization, the efforts to Zionize of the state of Israel, the consciousness of exilic Jews who are not supporters or proponents or even neutral vis-a-vis the project of Zionism and the state of Israel and its practical manifestation, then it becomes a crucial question, not just politically, also theologically. One has to have good theological answers for that. And so it leaves me, I don't understand if you are calling for de-Zionizing Judaism or de-Zionizing certain form of Judaism that Israel has, in one way or another, and Zionism harbored, or decolonizing Zionism and Israel, And I don't think these two things are equal. I'll tell you why. Because, Zionist state of Israel is a fact in the world. Yeah, it's a fact in the world. You want to push back against it, you push back against it, you do whatever, but it's a fact in the world. Any Jew will have to deal with this fact of the world because they speak in the name of the Jews. Yeah, it claims, the tenor of the Jewish people. It represented the Jews, after the Holocaust and the reparations vis-a-vis Germany. The entire world recognized, that the nation state of Israel, is the prime representative of Jews worldwide. Nation state, the nation state. This is it. And they are playing the game of sovereignty, So I don't see how can one still exist as a Jew even, without having a position, without in one way or another thinking that you have become a Zionist whether you want or not. Yeah. In this world, because the power politics, of how Jewishness and Judaism unfolded in the last century and its main, drivers and shapers hasn't been, unfortunately, the camp you side with, yeah, or the people, you identify with, non, halachic, orthodox, non-Zionist, exilic forms of Judaism. On the contrary, actually, the more powerful factor has been your antithesis in one way or another. So still, speaking as a Jew, which is distinguished from the Jew that the state of Israel and the Zionists, claim they are and they represent, politically doesn't really work. So some people like Mahmoud Mandani in his latest book comes and say, you need to de-Zionize Israel, the state. Yeah. Some people would have to say Judaism, as is, if you de-Zionize Israel, we've moved forward the state. Some people like you say we need to de-Zionize Judaism in one way or another. Yeah. That's, what you say, like the Zionization of Judaism has been, disastrous in one way or another. I would say that actually politically, neither what Mahmoud Mandani claims nor what you say has any purchase in reality, because the state of Israel is there. It will still, in one way or another, participate in the production of the discourse of who is a Jew, what is Judaism, how Judaism is practiced, and so on and so forth. And in this sense, what is needed probably, and here I go back to what Sam ended with in his last question, is probably to transform the entire way of thinking how to be a Jew in this world, by decolonizing, the Jewish state and decolonizing the Jewish mentality. And this also includes decolonizing also all the interlocutors of Jews, including Palestinians. I'm not here standing and saying we all need decolonization. And in this sense, then we can think like Amnon Raz Krakotkin proposed 25 years ago, in terms of exile within sovereignty, taking responsibility for the sovereignty, that there are Jews who practice sovereignty. Yeah, not saying they are Jews who practice sovereignty, we have nothing to do with this. Yeah, taking responsibility for that and saying exile within sovereignty. The way out is exile within sovereignty, because sovereignty is already there in the world. We cannot avoid it, we cannot avert it, we cannot roll it back. Yeah. So it's this dialectics between exile then and becomes unsovereignty, not exile versus sovereignty.
Well, it's an interesting position that you exposed. It's not really a question. What I can say is that there is a significant number of Jews who live around the world and also in Israel, for whom Zionism really plays no particular role. So unlike you, I don't think that everyone positions himself or herself as with respect to Zionism. Many do, but quite a few don't. And there is also another, and here we're talking about sort of the more observant, more orthodox people, but there's also a tendency in North America among young Jews who are not particularly religious, who are in fact liberal in many ways, and for whom Israel is irrelevant. They are not opposed to Israel, it's just not in the horizon for them. It's not something that they care about, either to criticize or to support. They are into spiritual values of kind of neo-Hasidism and so on. And according to surveys, they constitute about a quarter of young American Jews, which is a lot. So I understand your viewpoint, but I think empirically, there's quite a few significant numbers of Jews who just don't relate to it, for whom it's not very important, and who don't position themselves one way or another. Now, having said
I meant the Jews who are like you, not those who wrote the book and question.
No, I do care and I do position myself, so that's something else. But people I wrote about is something else. No, I think that for the situation on the ground in Israel and Palestine, I think there is an evolution, there's a social evolution happening. And there is, that's why you had this law of nationality in 2018, because why all of a sudden, after so many years of independent Israel, you need this law? Because apparently something goes wrong. Apparently there is a growing awareness that there is a new anthropological, political, social entity that has been created in Israel, and this is Israeli nation, which includes all kinds of people. I think this inclusive definition is opposed by that new law, but that new law has to be understood as precisely a reaction against a social reality, against a certain trend on the ground. And you know that better than I do. And including use of Hebrew language by non-Jews, by Arab writers, Palestinian writers. So I think there is a trend that makes the Zionist character of the State of Israel really anachronistic. And that's a kind of I wrote a book about demodernization, and in a way it's a demodernizing tendency. But it also has to be seen in a much larger context. I think we have
hyper-modernizing tendency as well.
Well, demodernizing in the sense that it's parochial, it's nationalistic, sometimes it's even racist. And this is part of the struggle going on in the world between forces of sort of universality and progress and so on, and forces of great gap between rich and poor, between different groups of people, between different races and so on. So Israel is positioned at the cusp of this struggle, which goes on in the world, goes on in many countries of the world. It's true that Israel has been extremely artful in positioning itself according to the prevailing winds. It was part of socialist movement in the 50s, and now it's one of the more capitalist countries with more unequal than, I think, like the United States. But what is important to understand that Israel benefited, for example, from the 30 years of the non-existence of the Soviet Union in many ways. So you have to see it in a much larger and not only geopolitical, but also ideological context. And that's why I'm just enlarging the framework. It has to be understood in that sense, because otherwise we cannot understand why the Arab Emirates are establishing relations and recognizing Israel. You can only understand that if you see the struggle going on around the world between two kinds of society, project of society.
Thank you. Thank you, Azar.
Thank you.
When you guys were discussing, what came to mind was something a friend of mine, another professor, Bernard Avishai, who wrote The Tragedy of Zionism. And he's well known to say that the strategic mistake of Israel was that after it was founded, it didn't take Zionism and put it into a museum. Instead, it embedded it into the institutions of the state, which got it to where it is today. This discussion is to be ongoing for sure. There are complicated issues to be looked at. This was
for me, that's a semantic thing, Sam. That's a semantic argument for me. You don't have to name it Zionism in order that it behaves the way it behaves.
Understood.
The way it produces Jews, the way it produced Jewish being and Jewish life and Jewish existence. Yeah,
I agree. But Israel's powerful today in projecting what they say as a default position of people who may be neutral to the issue, I think is a step too far. Because as we saw, and Professor alluded to it, in the US, especially in the Democratic Party, you have the Pew surveys, which are saying people are moving away from aligning themselves with any interest in Israel. That doesn't mean by default they should be labeled whatever Israel says they are, because I think that gives Israel too much default power over Jews in the world. But again, this is a discussion to be continued for sure. This was extremely informative and thought-provoking. Thank you both, and thank you to MADAR for hosting this event, translating and publishing the book into Arabic, which opens it up to an entire new audience. Anyone can order the Arabic version edition of What is Modern Israel by reaching out to MADAR. Their website is www.madar, M-A-D-A-R, center, center.org. Thank you all for participating, and we wish you all well. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Azar. And thank you,
Thank you for having me.